Welcome to my channel. Action Park, New Jersey. The park was first opened in Vernon, New Jersey in 1978. Action Park was one of the first modern water parks in the United States. However, it would soon become well known, but for all the wrong reasons. One popular ride was the Alpine Slide. This was a giant track which at the time, had lots of reports of ripping off people's skin while on this ride. The slide featured a long cement and fiberglass track, that visitors rode down in a wheeled device. The riders reached the ride on a ski lift, which took them to the beginning of the ride. Each rider was in charge of their own speed, but it was reported that often the brakes didn't work, meaning the rider had no way of slowing down. Other people report that their brakes were stuck on, which meant they just crawled along down the slope, putting them at risk of being hit by those riders behind them traveling at greater speeds. The park would see its first fatality on the Alpine Slide, when a 19-year-old employee rode off the track and hit his head. He would die of his injuries. It is also reported that at least 26 other people also suffered serious head injuries, and around 14 people suffered fractures due to the ride. If this wasn't enough to put you off going to Action Park, then why not try the tidal wave pool? Another of the park's notable attractions that would soon become one of the most dangerous places in the park. It was even nicknamed the Grave Pool. Filled with fresh water, it had 12 lifeguards on duty, who were said to have rescued at least 30 people per day at the weekends. Waves could reach quite high, leaving even strong swimmers overwhelmed. 3 people would go on to drown in the wave pool. However, the most famous of the dangerous rides at Action Park has to be the Cannonball Loop. It was an enclosed water slide with a complete vertical loop. It was said that the owners of the park sent a dummy doll down the ride, and it came out with no head on. Employees were offered $100 to test out the new ride. Employees ended up coming off the ride with bloody noses and several bruises, which in itself should have indicated that the ride was unsafe to the public, but the owners still decided to open up the ride to those visiting the park. One person who went on the ride is said to have gotten stuck. This resulted in the park building in a hatch so that riders who became stuck could escape. Again, this should have raised a red flag about the ride, but it still remained open. However, just a month after it was first opened, and after several injuries, the park decided to close the ride. Thankfully, this was closed before anyone was fatally injured. It was also reported that underage visitors to the park were able to drink beer quite freely. Doctors who treated injuries from the park often reported that those involved were also intoxicated, even though they were underage. The park seemed to let this take place. The park was also responsible for a 27-year-old man in 1982 who was electrocuted after his kayak tipped over on the park's kayak experience. His foot is said to have hit a metal grating that was exposed to a live wire. It wasn't long after this that the kayak experience would shut down. In 1984, a visitor died of a heart attack after riding the Tarzan swing. Action Park would finally close in 1996. By which time the park had been responsible for several fatalities. It wasn't until 2014 that the park was reopened under a new name. It is now known as Mountain Creek Water Park. Thankfully, it now has trained lifeguards and up-to-date standards and safety features. Hopefully it will now gain a reputation of being a safe park. Please continue watching. The Haunted Castle Fire. The Haunted Castle was an attraction at the Six Flags Great Adventure Park in New Jersey. It was a walk-through dark ride, which while inside featured monsters, skulls, and other frightening decorations, all aimed at scaring those who entered. Employees were dressed as mummies, vampires, and other scary creatures, and jumped out at those inside the castle. The haunted castle had first opened in 1978, and was then known as the Haunted House. It was not considered to be one of the park's most famous rides, but it attracted more visitors than the park had expected. The haunted castle was only considered to be a temporary structure, and was eventually assembled onto a new area of the park in 1979. Its walls were made of foam rubber, with other various fabrics and plastics as well as plywood and tar paper, all of which were highly flammable materials. Unbeknown to the park, the haunted castle would become the park's largest single show attraction and attracted thousands of visitors each year. However, that was all about to change. It was on May 11, 1984 at around 6:35 p.m., that a fire broke out at the attraction. Due to the flammable materials, the fire rapidly spread. Inside the castle at the time the fire broke out were around 29 people. 14 people, including 4 park employees, all managed to escape the burning building, with several of these having to be treated for smoke inhalation. At the time, there was much confusion. It was believed that those who had been inside the building had been safely evacuated. Firefighters quickly arrived on scene. The fire was eventually extinguished. Sadly, however, as firefighters combed through the remains, they found what at first they believed to be mannequins, but on closer inspection found it was the remains of 8 teenagers who had been unable to escape the fire, and were left trapped inside. Their deaths were not announced until 10:45 p.m. It hadn't been realized at the time that anyone had been left inside the fire, until the bodies were discovered. Sadly, they had been burnt beyond recognition, and it was believed that they had died as a result of smoke inhalation and carbon monoxide poisoning. At the time of the fire, the park had remained open to visitors. During the criminal trial, the Jackson Township fire inspector testified that he had never inspected the castle. It was considered to be a temporary structure, even though it had been in operation for over 5 years. It was also discovered that the building had lacked a building permit, a certificate of occupancy, fire and smoke detectors, as well as not even having a sprinkler system installed. Since the attraction had been built on 17 semi-trailers, it was considered to be a temporary structure, and had not been subject to the same building codes as that of permanent structures. It was on September 14, 1984, that a grand jury indicted Six Flags Great Adventure and its parent company, Six Flags, on the charge of aggravated manslaughter. The indictment also charged 2 park executives, and the general manager, with manslaughter. The trial began May 25, 1985. The prosecution argued that repeated warnings by safety consultants to install sprinklers and smoke alarms had just been ignored by the park, and they were never installed. If they had been installed, the outcome of that tragic night may have been a lot different, but we will never know. One boy who came forward as a witness claimed he had seen a boy accidentally set the fire with a cigarette lighter by brushing its flame against a foam wall. However, this boy was never found, and no other witnesses claim to have seen this happen. The park made a claim that smoke alarms had been installed, but due to problems with vandalism, they had not replaced them after 1979. The jury found the 2 companies not guilty of the charges, much to the dismay of the victims' relatives. The 2 park executives who had been charged with manslaughter avoided trial and imprisonment by entering a pre-trial intervention program that allowed them to do community service instead. Families of the victims filed civil suits against the owners of the Six Flags Great Adventure and the builders of the haunted castle. There is conflicting reports online about the families of the victims' settlements. In some websites, it states that 7 of the 8 families settled out of court for $2.5 million, with the 8th family choosing to go to trial, where they were awarded $750,000. Other websites states that all 8 families settled out of court for $2.5 million. However, whatever is the true case, it will never be enough for the loss of their loved ones on that tragic evening. It was after the fire at the haunted castle, that New Jersey decided to close all haunted house attractions pending further fire inspections. Due to the fire, the attendance at Six Flags fell dramatically, and the park was forced to close in 1987. The park would eventually again reopen. Now the part of the park where the haunted castle was once located is closed off to the public. No memorial has ever been erected at the park to remember those who died that tragic evening. Our hearts go out to the families of the victims. May your loved ones never be forgotten. For most of us, going to a theme park is supposed to be a joyous day out. Sadly, for a few, they will never return back home. We forever remember all those in this video who did not make it back home after the day out at these theme parks. May you never be forgotten. For all those watching, please stay safe. Please subscribe to my channel to view other content.